Hey guys, this is Emma, Vivobarefoot's head of sustainability, and I fucking hate the word sustainability. Join me as I talk to a whole bunch of people way smarter than me about how we're all going to make regeneration the new normal. Hey guys, and welcome to the Vivobarefoot Regeneration broadcast. Our guest today has had over 2 million views on his TED Talk about looking to the genius of nature in architecture. Michael Pawlyn is a leader in regenerative design, and many people will know him as the brains behind the Eden Project and the Sahara Forest Project. After months of listening to our innovation guy at Vivobarefoot talk about how much he worshipped you, we finally met you for lunch, and he ended up being far too nervous to talk to you, but you've become part of the family, and since then, you've been a huge part of building our new business strategy, inspiring us all to look to nature and consider regenerative and restorative solutions in everything that we do. So let's talk about that. I think at a small scale, we've proved that regenerative design and the circular economy is technically achievable and scientifically sustainable. So how do you think we can look towards regenerative design for the future, past coronavirus, and how it can help prevent future crises?
Well, I think COVID-19 is really going to force us to rethink our relationship with the rest of the living world. And, you know, we know that pandemics are going to become more frequent with climate change as we're increasingly disrupting ecosystems. And if we're really going to be serious about addressing that, we need to change the way we relate to the rest of the living world and stop looking at nature as something to be plundered or conquered. That's a really outdated mindset. And so it's time to start thinking about nature in a new way, about looking at it as actually a whole series of life support systems into which we need to integrate ourselves. And that may mean some fairly profound changes. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that more and more of these diseases are coming from livestock farming and from disrupting ecosystems. And so it may be also about changing our diet and eating really substantially less meat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting you talk about some of the discussion that's happening at the moment around whether or not this particular crisis had anything to do with our exploitation on nature. Do you believe what's being said and how do you think that it might have more to do with nature than perhaps just, you know, the meat making its way onto a market in Asia?
Well, it's probably a bit early to say for this one specifically, but you know, looking back at some of the other epidemics that didn't make it all the way through to full-blown pandemics, we know that a lot of those were zoonotic. You know, they came from animals. If we're going to prevent that happening again, we really need to, I think, restore nature on a massive scale and transform the way we make things and the way we conduct agriculture. I think there's a good case for moving quite a bit of agriculture indoors into urban farming and I'm just talking about plants here, changing the way we produce the small amount of meat that perhaps some people will still want to eat into a much fairer, more nature-based way of producing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting when we talk about solutions, I think, because one of the things I've always admired about you is that you speak about a future that isn't really there yet, and you're kind of creating and helping people visualize this wonderful, almost utopian future through your architecture and your designs. What part do you think that plays in helping people imagine and really put into action, you know, the creation of this new world that we need to have after all of this? And I guess the question is, what is regenerative design? Not a lot of people, you know what that is really, and how do you apply that to your vision for the future?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the simple way of framing regenerative design is it's about striving for a positive impact in everything we do. Up until now, most of the stuff we've done, and this is very much part of the sustainability paradigm, it's really been about trying to mitigate negatives. And I think it's increasingly obvious that that's not a particularly inspiring vision. I mean, given the choice, who would consciously want to be part of a degenerative cycle. But that's what sustainability is really. It's just to a greater or lesser extent a degenerative way of living. And we know that one way or another, we all have to individually and as companies and as countries shift towards a regenerative way of operating in which we strive to have a positive impact in everything we do. And that's potentially quite transformative to architecture. You know, it changes the way we think about cities, buildings, and the materials we use. And I think it's very useful to start from a systems perspective. And so, you know, if you start at the level of a planet, James Lovelock, with his Gaia theory, he argued pretty persuasively that the Earth has evolved into an incredibly complex, self-regulating system. And it's like a sort of nested set of systems at lots of different scales. So from the scale of a planet down to regions, down to ecosystems, and even as individual organisms. We know now that humans are not just a single species. Our human cells are actually outnumbered 10 to 1 by microbial cells. So really, we are ourselves ecosystems. We're not just individuals. And we're completely tied into and dependent on those broader systems, which we increasingly need to see continuously as part of our health. Our health is indivisible from planetary health. So if we start to design from that perspective and try to work out how to integrate ourselves and cities and buildings into those broader systems, it starts to imply a whole new discipline about how resources flow through those systems. We need to shift from linear to cyclical ways. And it also implies a very different discipline about the materials we use. It's going to move us towards more and more materials that are actually grown rather than mined or quarried or synthesized. And those grown materials, increasingly we're going to want to use materials that are actually grown from atmospheric carbon. Now, timber is a fairly obvious example of that. And there are some other really interesting ones as well. And if we do more of that, if we use more materials made from atmospheric carbon in our buildings, then we're effectively taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And that way, every building we create could have a positive impact, not just on the atmosphere, but on our ecosystems as well.
Wow, I always feel so uneducated when I talk to you. Do you feel like, you know, kind of in typical cynical me fashion, I'm going to ask the question, do you feel like the concept of regenerative design and what you've just described then is there to be exploited? And are you seeing people exploit it now? And I guess the follow-up question is, how do we overcome that? And how do we get people genuinely coming up with new innovative solutions, not kind of exploiting existing ways of talking about things like, you know, cutting down forests to make buildings?
Well, I think there's a key difference between a regenerative approach and an extractive approach. So you could use timber in both ways. You know, if you just cut down a forest and use that to build with, then that's clearly an extractive approach. If you cut down a forest that is carefully managed and you replant more than you actually use, then that's a regenerative approach. And while that timber is growing, it's providing habitats for a whole load of ecosystems and delivering a whole series of benefits. Well, it specifically must not be an exploitative approach. A truly regenerative approach has to deliver a whole range of benefits.
Absolutely. And since your TED Talk came out, what role do you think that, sharing the message, spreading the message in this way and kind of almost taking a subject that's incredibly complicated and very scientific and very mathematical and kind of making it digestible to more and more people? And obviously, how do we redesign the future in a better way?
Well, I mean, it's taken quite a long time. So my TED Talk was, I don't know, it's like 8 years ago now. And I thought that we were on the cusp then of really shifting towards biologically inspired ways of doing things and a fully regenerative approach. And it's only recently that interest is growing steadily in that area. But I think now the use of the term regenerative is growing exponentially. I've found more and more people referring to that, more and more companies wanting to be regenerative companies. And I guess a lot of people and a lot of companies are now asking themselves more searching questions about what's their long-term purpose. And very few, hardly any companies would seriously say they wanted to have a long-term extractive, degenerative purpose. They want to deliver benefits. And I think, some of the old ways of looking at things in a very reductive way that is just about cost, benefits and profitability. I think those people know that there's a younger generation who find that increasingly unacceptable. And, who would really want to bring up a kid and then when that kid is a sort of late teenager, to be thoroughly disapproved of by that kid. And, that's part of my motivation. One of the reasons that I've committed so much of the last 12 years since I set up Exploration to pursuing these kind of approaches is because I want to be able to look my kids straight in the eye in another 10 years' time and say, yeah, I did everything I could to try and make things better. We won't be able to prevent all the negative impacts that are coming our way, but there's still everything to fight for. And I want to be able to say that to them with a clear conscience.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually personally sit in a really funny space where, my parents were baby boomers, but I'm not young enough to be part of Greta's, following. So I kind of sit in a really weird space where I grew up in the 90s and was bombarded with, mindless kind of pop culture and was super aware that we weren't doing the greatest things to the world, but also if you were caring about that, you were very, very marginalized, and so I'm struggling to find an identity in mid-corporate level where I still need to work and pay rent, but still want to, kind of be part of the change and listening to conversations at the very top about how the old way of doing things was and, how that new younger generation is expecting things to happen. And I guess my question is, to get to that future, there needs to be a ton of doing things differently. And one of those things is having businesses that you mentioned all working on the same topics. A lot of these things are very, very anti-competitive and they're very reliant on collaboration, whether you're talking about the footwear industry and a company like Vivobarefoot who, for all intents and purposes, this regeneration mission we're on is not we are on it. It's we want the industry to be on it. And we already know that there are some people on that journey. And I think the way that you simplified that to, talking about that net positive and is it better than it was before you went there is a really good way of kind of breaking it down. How about in the architecture and design industry? Like, do you find that there's an appetite now to have a lot more open conversation around how to design our cities, our communities, our society in a better way?
Well, yes and no. I think it's been a weird time because for some time now we've had nearly all the solutions necessary to make rapid progress on climate change and biodiversity and so on. But it just hasn't been happening at anywhere near the speed or scale. And I sincerely believe what we need is a major tipping point where the kind of frame of what is regarded as politically possible shifts a lot. It did shift quite a bit with the climate strikes and with Extinction Rebellion. There's a real possibility that the pandemic will shift that even further. And I don't want to sound sort of insensitive and opportunistic about it because obviously there are some people undergoing real suffering at the moment. And clearly we need to address that as the first priority. But at the same time, phases of disruption like this can open up new possibilities. And I get this strong sense that things are changing very rapidly at the moment. And things that would have been regarded as impossible just 1 month ago are happening now. So, for instance, Spain has introduced the universal basic income. I think we're going to completely change the way that we travel and do business. I think there's a very strong sense that we just can't go back to normal because normal was part of the problem, and we need to forge an entirely new normal and try to make a kind of bridge between an immediate health crisis and a looming planetary health crisis of arguably a much bigger scale. And, one other shift that we've seen that's been pretty dramatic is in the attitude towards experts and scientists. prior to the pandemic, governments in the UK and the US and so on were pretty dismissive of experts and scientists. Now they realize that they have to listen to scientific advice. And I think it's going to be pretty tough for them once we're past the worst of the pandemic. I think it's going to be pretty tough for them to say, well, no, we can carry on ignoring scientific advice about climate change.
It's funny you say that. I think it's quite ironic because in what I do in sustainability, I quite regularly get called an expert. And it's just the greatest case of, I just do not deserve that title. I've dedicated the hours that I have in the day to, trying to kind of come up with the solutions. And I like to call myself the glorified shin kicker. So all I do is just kind of run from meeting to meeting, kind of kicking people in the shins, being like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? This is non-negotiable. And I guess my hope, and of course, I hear you when you say, obviously be sensitive to the fact that the situation for a lot of people right now is incredibly difficult. I guess my hope is that, there will be more of a movement around people now that this thing reminded us that we're all connected. And as you said before, very much reliant on nature and our natural systems. I'm super hopeful that people will get courage out of this. And I really want to see a tipping point around courage. I guess that's I kind of check myself because I don't want to say hope because someone else isn't going to do it. We've jumped on this podcast and I'm trying to create a belief now that there's going to be a tipping point around courage, because I think the thing with sustainability and what you said about it being so reliant on systems and systems thinking is that we can't, as individuals, fix all of those nodes. We have to rely on this cultural change so that every single individual can take that responsibility and apply it to their area of interest. I mean, you're already carrying so much on your shoulders because your expertise at a very deep level is in architecture and design, and yet you're playing in the ballpark of politics and business and media, and I think that's fantastic, and I really hope and wish that more people do that. And so I guess I'll wrap up by asking, what is your call to action? I mean, the people that will listen to this will be people from all walks of life. So what is the kind of one big call to action you would have?
Well, you use the word courage there, which is a really good word. I've been talking a lot about agency with some of my crowd recently. Agency, another way of putting that is the kind of capacity to bring about change. And I've seen a lot of minimization of agency in the professional world. Often architects, even very senior influential ones, say that there's not much they can do unless they've got a really fantastic client. Sometimes big companies say, well, there's not much we can do because we're answerable to our shareholders. People in the media say, well, we have to just produce what the public wants and what the advertisers will tolerate and so on. And the problem with that minimization of agency is that it's kind of contagious, to use a slightly awkward word. It encourages other people to minimize their agency. The good news is that if you flip that, and if each of us tries to maximize our own agency, then it has a positive impact on other people. And that's what I really think we need to do. I read a really entertaining and inspiring book recently called Be More Pirate by Sam Conifayende. And at the end of that, he talks about the idea of compound imagination. So with compound interest, you see a sort of exponential rise. And I've been talking of kind of adapting that to talk about compound agency. Because I think if we all seek to maximize our own agency, we could achieve a kind of compound effect of agency. And, we could be in a state of really rapid and profound positive change. And we could come out of this with a much better relationship with the living world, a much fairer society in which we look after people better and provide better opportunities for people to achieve their full potential and so on. So, there's a lot to play for. And I'd like to encourage everyone to see how they can maximize their agency.
I love that so much. Compound agency. That's absolutely wonderful. I think you've just come up with your next TED Talk, by the way.
Thanks, Emma. It's about time I did another.
You didn't have enough on your to-do list, did you? All right, so I'll wrap up and just say a huge thank you for joining us. And if anyone wants to learn more about what you do and what you're working on, where can they go?
Well, we've got a website, exploration-architecture.com. And the other thing I've been very active on recently is a thing called, it started as Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. So we launched that 11 months ago, so in May last year. And we then expanded it to Construction Declares. So we expanded it to other disciplines. And we've been absolutely thrilled with the way that's taken off. So it's now been launched in 20 other countries. We're now approaching 5,000 companies that have signed up to an 11-point declaration. And just yesterday, we had the first big Zoom meeting with instigators in 15 different countries. It was really inspiring and energizing.
Wow, that is.
So I'd encourage anyone in the construction industry to look up constructiondeclares.com.
Amazing. I love it. Yeah, we absolutely will share your message, and we look forward to continue our conversation. Thanks so much, Michael.
Cool.
Cheers.
Thanks very much, Ellen. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's it for today. If you managed to get the entire way through this podcast without getting really annoyed by my bloody Australian accent, you deserve an award. For more information and to listen to the other episodes, go to vivobarefoot.com. See you later.